If you look at Hudson and Rex today, it almost feels like you're looking at two completely different shows stitched together under the same name. There's the version people fell in love with, the one that built a loyal fanbase over years, the one that felt consistent, grounded, and emotionally real. And then there's what came after. A version that looks similar on the surface, but feels completely different underneath. And that shift didn't happen slowly. It didn't evolve over time. It happened the moment one decision was made, the moment the core of the show was removed, and everything that followed has been a direct consequence of that choice. For years, Hudson and Rex worked because of something very simple, something you can't fake and you definitely can't recreate overnight. It had chemistry. Not just between characters, but between the story, the tone, and the audience watching it. People didn't just tune in for cases or episodic mysteries. They showed up because they were invested. They cared about what they were watching. And that kind of connection doesn't come from writing alone. It comes from consistency, from familiarity, from a sense that what you're watching actually matters. That's what kept people coming back season after season. And then suddenly, that foundation was shaken. Not in a subtle way, not in a way that gave the audience time to adjust, but in a way that felt abrupt and final. The kind of change that immediately makes people question whether the show they've been following is still the same show at all. Because when you remove something essential, something central to how everything works, you don't just create a gap. You create a ripple effect. Every scene feels different. Every interaction feels slightly off. And even if you can't explain it right away, you feel it. Season 8 is where that feeling became impossible to ignore. From the very beginning, there was a sense that something wasn't right. Not because the show had suddenly become unwatchable, but because it had lost its identity. The tone shifted. The emotional weight wasn't the same. And the connection that once felt natural now felt forced. It's the kind of change that doesn't need to be pointed out because the audience already knows. They can feel it in every episode, in every moment that doesn't land the way it used to. What makes it even more impactful is how quickly the reaction came. This wasn't something that built up over time. The response to Season 8 was immediate. Fans noticed the difference right away, and they didn't stay quiet about it. Conversations started shifting. Instead of talking about storylines or standout moments, people started asking a much bigger question: what happened to this show? And once that question starts circulating, it's incredibly hard to stop. Because here's the reality that a lot of productions don't want to admit. Audiences are more aware than ever. They know when something changes, and they know when that change doesn't work. You can't rely on branding or familiarity to carry you through a major shift like this. If anything, those things make the contrast even more obvious. People remember what the show used to be, and when the new version doesn't match that standard, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. And that's exactly what happened here. Season 8 didn't just struggle because it was different. It struggled because it felt disconnected from everything that came before it. The emotional core that once held everything together was missing, and without that core, the rest of the show started to feel like it was trying to compensate for something it couldn't replace. And the audience saw right through it. This is where the real problem begins. Because once viewers start pulling away, once they start losing that emotional investment, it doesn't just affect one episode or one season. It affects everything moving forward. The momentum that carried the show for years starts to fade. The loyalty that once guaranteed consistent viewership starts to break. And suddenly, the show that felt stable and reliable begins to feel uncertain. And that uncertainty is exactly what set the stage for what happened next. Because even with all the warning signs, even with the reaction to Season 8 becoming impossible to ignore, the decision was made to keep going. To push forward as if nothing had fundamentally changed. And that decision is what ultimately led to the end of everything, and this is where things stop being just a creative misstep and start turning into something much bigger. Because what happened after Season 8 wasn't confusion. It wasn't uncertainty. The signs were clear. The reaction was loud. The message from the audience couldn't have been more direct. and yet, the decision that followed ignored all of it. Instead of stepping back and asking what went wrong, instead of taking a moment to understand why the connection with the audience had broken, the show moved forward like nothing had changed. And that's the part that makes this entire situation so frustrating to look at. Because this wasn't a slow decline that no one could see coming. This was immediate. It was obvious. And it was completely avoidable. By the time season 8 had finished airing, the damage was already done. The ratings had dropped in a way that couldn't be explained away. The conversations around the show had shifted completely. Loyal viewers who had been there from the beginning were no longer defending it. They were walking away from it. And when a show loses the very audience that built it, that's not just a problem, that's a warning sign that everything is about to fall apart. But instead of treating it like a warning, it was treated like a challenge. A challenge to prove that the show could still survive, that it could push forward and rebuild what had been lost without actually fixing the core issue that caused the problem in the first place. And that's where season 9 comes into the picture. Because while the audience was still reacting to season 8, while the backlash was still growing, while people were still making it clear that something was fundamentally broken, season 9 was already happening behind the scenes. Filming moved forward. Production wrapped. And all of it was done quietly, almost like the show was trying to outrun the criticism instead of addressing it. And for a moment, it created this strange sense of disbelief among the fans who were still paying attention. Because it didn't make sense. How do you move forward so quickly after such a strong negative reaction? How do you look at falling numbers, critical feedback, and a fractured audience, and still decide that the right move is to double down instead of course correct? That decision didn't rebuild confidence. It did the opposite. It made the situation feel even more disconnected from reality. Because from the outside, it looked like the people making these choices were no longer listening. Not to the audience, not to the feedback, not even to the results that were already in front of them. And once that perception sets in, it becomes incredibly difficult to win people back. At that point, the conversation around Hudson and Rex wasn't about anticipation anymore. It wasn't about excitement for what season 9 might bring. It had shifted into something else entirely. It became a question. A very simple but very important question: does this show even understand what made it work in the first place? And the longer that question went unanswered, the more damage it did. Because audiences don't just disconnect overnight. They slowly lose interest. They stop prioritizing the show. They stop recommending it. And eventually, they stop watching altogether. And once that process starts, it's incredibly hard to reverse. What makes this situation even more complicated is that filming a season doesn't guarantee anything. Just because something has been completed doesn't mean it will ever reach the audience in the way it was intended. Networks and studios make decisions based on performance, on perception, and on potential risk. And by the time season 9 was finished, all three of those factors were working against it. The performance had already declined. The perception around the show had shifted in a negative direction. And the risk of releasing another season that might continue that downward trend was becoming harder to ignore. Because if season 9 failed the same way season 8 did, it wouldn't just be another disappointment. It would confirm that the show couldn't recover from the decision that changed everything. And that's when the conversation started to change again. Not just among fans, but across the entire discussion surrounding the show. Instead of asking what season 9 would fix, people started asking whether it would even be released at all. Because at that point, the idea that a completed season might never see the light of day didn't sound unrealistic anymore. It sounded possible. And once that possibility enters the conversation, everything shifts. The focus moves away from the content itself and onto the future of the show as a whole. Because now it's not just about whether the story works. It's about whether the show can survive at all, and that's exactly where Hudson and Rex found itself. Caught between a past that people loved and a present that wasn't working, trying to move forward without addressing the one thing that caused the entire collapse. And as that tension kept building, as the gap between the show and its audience kept growing, It was only a matter of time before something had to give. And when it finally did, it didn't come quietly, and when everything finally caught up to the show, it didn't happen slowly. It didn't fade out over time or quietly disappear in the background. It hit all at once. Because by the time the conversation shifted from what's next to "is this even worth continuing," the outcome was